The Tempest Duel begins. Episode 8, Trial of Power. The combat arena where the Tempest Duel would take place was older than most human civilizations, carved from a single mountain during Asgard's founding, enchanted with magic that could contain and measure divine power, and bearing scorch marks from 9,000 years of Thor's family testing their worthiness in trials that had become legend. Storm stood at one end of the massive circular platform, surrounded by thousands of Asgardians who'd come to witness the challenge. At the opposite end, Thor raised Mjolnir, and the hammer's response, crackling electricity, gathering storm clouds, the sound of thunder that made stone vibrate, reminded everyone present why he'd been called the God of Thunder for over a millennium. Tyr stood at the arena's center, his voice amplified through magic that made him audible across the entire structure. The Tempest Duel proceeds under ancient law. 4 trials will test the challengers: power, control, application, and philosophy. The first trial begins now. Demonstrate the maximum storm you are capable of generating. The arena's enchantments will measure destructive potential, atmospheric displacement, and divine resonance. You will be judged not just on strength, but on the fundamental connection between your essence and the weather you command. Thor moved first, raising Mjolnir skyward while channeling power that had leveled armies. The sky responded immediately, clouds boiling into existence from clear air, lightning striking the arena's protective barriers with force that made the ancient enchantments strain, winds that reached velocities capable of shredding steel. This wasn't a storm in the conventional sense. This was weather as weapon, atmosphere as expression of divine wrath, the kind of tempest that had made Asgardians worship Thor's ancestors before recorded history began. The arena's measuring crystals, massive structures positioned around the platform's perimeter, glowed with readings that made Asgardian scholars frantically record data. Thor's storm registered at magnitudes that most beings couldn't survive without magical protection, demonstrating why he'd been considered supreme over weather for 1,000 years. When the storm dissipated, Thor was breathing heavily but standing firm, Mjolnir still raised, lightning playing across his armor in patterns that suggested the hammer and its wielder were extensions of the same fundamental force. "Impressive," Storm said, loud enough for Thor to hear across the arena's distance. "But power without purpose is just destruction with divine branding." She raised her hands, and the atmosphere responded in ways that made every weather-sensitive being present feel their instincts scream warnings. A storm's mutation allowed her to manipulate weather on Earth through conscious control of atmospheric elements: temperature, pressure, humidity, electrical charge, wind currents. But Earth was her native reality, where her X gene had evolved in harmony with terrestrial physics. Asgard was different. The dimensional barrier that had pulled her here still existed as a thin connection to Earth's weather patterns. Nan Storm did something she'd never attempted before. She channeled terrestrial storms through that connection into Asgard's realm, creating a hybrid tempest that operated on rules from 2 different realities simultaneously. The effect was spectacular and terrifying. Storm's hurricane drew power from Earth's tropical systems while manifesting in Asgard's divine atmosphere, creating a storm that existed partially in both realities and therefore couldn't be measured accurately by instruments designed for single-dimensional weather. Lightning struck with frequencies that defied Asgardian physics. Winds achieved velocities that shouldn't be possible in Asgard's carefully regulated climate, and most significantly, the storm carried signatures that the measuring crystals couldn't quantify. Mutant energy interfacing with divine magic in ways that suggested Storm's power wasn't just biological mutation, but something that resonated with atmospheric forces at a fundamental level. When Storm's tempest dissipated, the measuring crystals displayed readings that made Tyr consult with other scholars in urgent whispers. The measurements are... Tyr paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase results that contradicted expectations. Inconclusive. Prince Thor's storm demonstrates greater raw destructive potential. His tempest could level cities, reshape coastlines, sink fleets. By traditional measurements of divine power, his storm is superior. However, Storm's tempest demonstrates complexity that our instruments cannot fully measure. She's generating weather that operates on principles from multiple realities simultaneously. Her power is not greater than Thor's, but it is fundamentally different in ways that suggest different types of supremacy. So who won? Volstagg called from the audience, expressing the question every Asgardian present wanted answered. Neither, Tyr replied, or both. The trial of power demonstrates that Thor commands greater force, while Storm commands greater complexity. Which is more valuable depends on what you believe Storm mastery should accomplish. If the purpose is destroying enemies, Thor is superior. If the purpose is demonstrating understanding of weather as multi-dimensional phenomenon, Storm is superior. The law requires 4 trials precisely because power alone is insufficient to prove worthiness. Thor and Storm exchanged glances across the arena, mutual respect mixed with recognition that neither had the decisive advantage they'd hoped for. The second trial required demonstrating precision rather than power. Tyr conjured scenarios using the arena's illusion magic, holographic projections of situations where weather manipulation required surgical accuracy rather than overwhelming force. You will each face the same challenges, Tyr explained. Generate rain sufficient to extinguish a single burning building without damaging structures nearby. Create lightning that strikes specific targets without collateral damage. Manipulate wind to prevent a falling aircraft from crashing without creating turbulence that endangers other vessels. You will be judged on accuracy, efficiency, and demonstration that you command individual atmospheric elements rather than just generating storms wholesale. Thor went first, approaching each challenge with the determination of someone who'd realized this trial would test capabilities he'd never had to develop. His Thunder God reputation was built on overwhelming force, storms that destroyed everything in their path, lightning that struck with devastating power, winds that scattered armies. Surgical precision had never been necessary when victory came through superior strength. The burning building scenario demonstrated his limitations immediately. Thor summoned rain with his usual efficiency, but controlling its distribution proved difficult. He flooded the target buildings successfully, extinguishing flames, but also soaked 3 adjacent structures and created flash flooding in the illusory street below. Not catastrophic, but not precise. The lightning challenge was worse. Thor's electrical attacks were devastating but broad. His bolts struck the designated targets but also scorched areas around them, demonstrating that millennia of using lightning as weapon had never taught him how to make it surgical. The falling aircraft challenge was closest to his comfort zone. Thor was accustomed to rescuing people, to using wind manipulation for heroic purposes rather than just combat. He caught the projected aircraft with updrafts that prevented its crash, though the turbulence he generated in the process made nearby holographic vessels wobble dangerously. When Thor completed his challenges, the measuring crystals displayed ratings that were competent but unremarkable. He'd succeeded at the minimum requirements but hadn't demonstrated mastery. Storm approached the same challenges with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades using weather manipulation for purposes beyond combat. The burning building scenario was almost trivial for her. Storm generated localized rain that fell only on the target structure, adjusting precipitation rates in real time to maximize extinguishing effect while minimizing water damage. She'd done this hundreds of times during X-Men rescue operations, understanding intuitively how much water was needed for specific fire intensities. The lightning challenge demonstrated capabilities that made Asgardian scholars frantically take notes. Storm didn't just strike the designated targets, she varied the voltage and amperage for each strike, delivering electrical charge calibrated to exactly what each target required. The projections showed targets ranging from small drones to armored vehicles to magical constructs that absorbed electricity. Storm hit all of them with lightning, customized for their specific vulnerabilities, demonstrating that her weather control extended to manipulating electrical properties at a granular level Thor had never developed. The aircraft challenge showcased her signature elegance. Rather than catching the falling vessel with crude updrafts, a storm created a series of precisely calibrated air pressure differentials that gently adjusted the aircraft's descent trajectory, slowing it gradually while generating zero turbulence that would affect other vessels. She'd rescued falling aircraft dozens of times during her X-Men career, perfecting a technique that was more surgery than brute force. When Storm completed her challenges, the measuring crystals glowed with ratings that made Tyr's pronouncement almost unnecessary. Storm demonstrates superior control, Tyr announced. Where Thor commands weather as weapon, Storm commands it as tool. Where Thor's manipulation is broad and powerful, Storm's is precise and efficient. In this trial, the mutant proves herself superior to the god, not in power, but in mastery of the elements she commands. The Asgardian audience's reaction was mixed. Gasps from those who'd never imagined a mortal could surpass Thor. The approving murmurs from those who'd questioned whether Birthright alone qualified someone for kingship, and calculating silence from the traditionalist faction who saw Storm's superiority in this trial as dangerous precedent. Thor's expression was complicated, pride wounded, but also something that looked like genuine respect. He'd just been outperformed in front of his entire realm by someone whose control of weather exceeded his own, despite having commanded storms for only a fraction of his lifespan. "Well fought," Thor said to Storm across the arena. "You've demonstrated capabilities I never developed because I never needed to. But we have 2 trials remaining, and I suspect they will test aspects of Storm mastery where experience matters as much as control."